Today, we're going to compare ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Civic nationalism defines the nation by shared political values, laws, and institutions. It focuses more on consent and citizenship instead of ancestry, which means it is often going to be inclusive of multiple ethnic backgrounds within society. Membership is tied to citizenship, and this is often obtained based on criteria such as having language and civic knowledge, residency in the country for a period of time, and sometimes an amount of contribution. You currently see civic nationalism across many countries today. Examples are found across the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Australia, and the United States. Ethnic nationalism defines the nation through shared ancestry and culture. Citizenship is often determined by common descent. Membership is tied to bloodline and heritage. You're born into it. You see forms of ethnic nationalism such as descent-based citizenship rules in countries like Israel, Hungary, Poland, Japan, and South Korea. Ethnic nationalism should be the more reliable way for a country's ancestral population to protect their distinct identity. If these populations want to preserve their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture, they will benefit from considering solutions that are focused on ethnic nationalism when creating their governance system. In a previous video, we covered some different approaches for creating a governance system that adopts a mixture of ethnic and civic solutions for representation, voting, and citizenship. Civic nationalism overlaps with liberalism on the topic of equality. Civic nationalism advocates for the equal treatment of people under the law. And this approach of embracing full equality in a multicultural society leads to a number of flaws that we discussed in my other video about liberalism and following it to its potential conclusions. With civic nationalism, it is more difficult to protect ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture over the long term when you are not willing to discriminate on the basis of identity. Civic nationalism relies on the goodwill of emerging population majorities and the hope that historical institutions and policies that protect minorities are not changed. Otherwise, minorities will not be reliably protected. Identifying the differences between distinct identities and communities and prioritizing certain ones at a national level can go against the idea of treating people equally. Civic nationalism can increase the risk of a potential collapse of some identities due to the differences in rates of reproduction or migration from different communities. The collapse of some populations could also happen due to conflict and civil war, or due to ancestral communities emigrating and leaving the country, which might be due to an unfavorable or hostile environment. Two approaches to government that could be adopted are an ethnic nation-state or a civic nation-state. An example, implementation of an ethnic nation-state could be where government representatives can only be elected if they are from a certain ethnic background. They must have a common descent and bloodline. Civic nation-states are governments where representatives just need to be a citizen in the country. Citizens could come from any ethnic background. A multicultural society could be adopted alongside either an ethnic nation-state or a civic nation-state. You can adopt ideas that lean towards ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism at the same time. A nation-state government doesn't have to be fully one or the other. In reality, many countries have a mixture of policies that blend ideas from either ethnic nationalism or civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism can make it easier to handle cultural differences, as if the ancestral population have an ethnic nation-state. They can make the government responsible for removing individuals and communities that are exhibiting behaviors and values that are not aligned with the preferences of the ancestral population. With civic nationalism, changing demographics increase the likelihood that the ancestral population would have to accept changes that they might not have accepted if they made the decision themselves. Changing demographics are not as much of a threat to the ancestral population. An ethnic nation-state could mean that only the ancestral population could become representatives or vote in elections. With civic nationalism, changes in demographics can be highly risky, potentially introducing tribalism into politics. The larger the differences that exist between communities, the more the likelihood there is for disputes and conflict to emerge. tribalism should be less of an issue with ethnic nation states, as governance would always be handled by the ancestral population, if the non-ancestral population don't agree that they can migrate back to their own ancestral homeland. With an ethnic nation state, the non-ancestral communities that might become a majority in the future wouldn't change the fact that the ancestral population would always have self-determination. They would govern their own future. This is not the case for civic nationalism, as now non-ancestral communities can use their voting power to influence elections and policy decisions. You need less than the majority of the ancestral population to be combined with the non-ancestral voting power to secure a voting power majority. This means decisions could be made that do not reflect the preferences of the majority of the ancestral population. The larger the non-ancestral population, the more difficult it becomes to protect the interests and preferences of the ancestral population. If the ancestral population doesn't like that outcome, it becomes even harder to change migration policy to remove these communities. Why would the non-ancestral communities support a vote to remove themselves? Civic nationalism can lead to outcomes where distinct ancestral identities lose their self-determination. Ethnic nation-states provide more guarantees around how governance will be handled in the future. Ultimately, it is up to the ancestral population. It's their preferences that need to change for policies to be introduced that reflect those changing preferences. With civic nation-states, it is either changing preferences from the existing population or changing demographics. A new and emerging majority could have entirely different preferences and values than the previous majority. No one can guarantee the continuation of liberal ideas or civic values. A new majority could start making changes that are in the interest of that new majority. An ethnic nation-state doesn't mean that people aren't treated fairly. All residents, whether citizens or not, can benefit from either similar or the same treatment under the law, access to the same goods and services, the ability to live where they want, and join any activities and public groups that they prefer. Some key differences between ethnic nation-states and civic ones is who has voting power and who can be a representative in government. The ethnic nation-state is effective for protecting distinct identities and their preferences and interests. It also doesn't prevent multiculturalism or other communities from being able to reside in that country. If you want to prevent the ancestral population from eventually losing self-determination, and you also want to protect their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture, you likely want to use solutions that lean towards ethnic nationalism. The larger the amount of differences there are between two communities, such as their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture, the more important it is to be wary of what could happen due to migration policy or rates of reproduction. With civic nationalism, you provide little to no guarantees on being able to protect the ancestral population's self-determination along with their interests and preferences. It takes time to understand and experience the differences in culture that migrants may bring into a society. Migration that is too large in number or that happens too fast could have a dramatic impact on social cohesion. And regardless of the amount of migration that a country accepts, this doesn't mean that migrants need to be offered citizenship. Short or long-term visas that are easily renewable are perfectly viable alternatives. Non-ancestral residents don't need to be citizens with voting rights to benefit from living in another country. To give an example of a governance system that leans towards ethnic nationalism that is worth talking about is the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE. The UAE is an example of a highly multicultural society that I think is working well. Their approach to governance protects their ancestry, genetics, and heritage. It also gives them control over how they maintain and evolve their culture. Let's talk about how they handle representation, voting, and citizenship. The distinct identity and ethnic population of the UAE is the Emiratis. Their governance solution in practice is one that prioritizes Emiratis over other distinct identities. In the UAE, only Emirati citizens are representatives in government. For voting, the UAE doesn't use a democratic system that is decided by the people, but it is a solution based on ancestry and heritage. The obvious problem with their undemocratic voting solution is it does remove some of the self-determination for the Emirati population. So there's obviously some room for critique in this part of their governance system. For citizenship, only Emiratis receive citizenship by descent, but they do allow people to become citizens from other countries, which is a civic-leaning policy. The key thing to note, though, with their citizenship policy, however, is that it is extremely strict. There are only a very small number of people that have obtained citizenship, and it commonly involves making massive contributions to the country. This does have the very long-term problem of potentially reducing the self-determination of the Emirati population if the recent non-ancestral citizens outgrow their population. The vast majority of people that migrate to the UAE and become a resident are using one of the numerous types of visas that are available. Visa holders have no rights to vote on how the society is governed. Residents can benefit from the majority of the available economic opportunities that exist in the country. And for the most part, they can live in most places across the country, purchase the same goods and services as others, and can join most activities or public groups that exist. The UAE is a good example of a multicultural society that leans towards ethnic nationalist solutions. The total number of Emiratis is only between 1 and 2 million, whereas the total population is now over 10 million. Over 8 million people are choosing to reside in the UAE rather than other countries. They don't need to be there, yet they still want to be there. These residents aren't being given citizenship. They don't have the same rights as Emiratis, but they still can greatly benefit from being in the country. Only Emirati citizens can access some form of welfare benefits. This helps to prevent situations where non-ancestral residents could try to abuse their own welfare system. If migrants are coming to the UAE, they need to have enough wealth to survive themselves, or they need to get a job that pays for their lifestyle. The UAE government doesn't provide welfare to people from other backgrounds. It is the responsibility of the migrant to create a business or work to make their money or to fund their own lifestyle themselves. This policy is very effective for protecting the interests of the Emiratis. It makes it much more difficult for anyone to exploit their government. Another reason their system for multiculturalism works well is they are more authoritarian. They deport people that break the rules, they give out large fines, and they practice capital punishment. With such a small ancestral population, this approach makes sense, as it becomes harder to maintain order and protect their citizens and culture due to the scale of the migrants that have been invited in. So, having very strict laws and regulations forces people to behave as expected. Otherwise, they will be fined, deported, or in some cases, even face the death penalty. These policies result in a situation where it only makes sense for people to become a resident in the UAE if they have economic opportunities in the country or because they want to benefit from the lifestyle it can offer. Their government system and policies could be contributing factors towards why the country is so safe. Their governance approach for protecting the ancestral population whilst also embracing multiculturalism makes a lot of sense, as now they aren't constantly battling the unknown, where changing demographics could have resulted in new communities expressing their own preferences. Communities that may even start to make demands in an attempt to change society to match their own preferences and interests. Policy changes that could come at the expense of the country and the ancestral population. Instead of an environment that creates all of that potential chaos in a civic-based nation-state, the Emiratis are the ones that govern the nation. And if you have a reason to reside in the country and benefit from it, you're welcome to do so. If you have a problem with how they govern the country, you're always welcome to leave. Civic nationalism would be extremely risky in the UAE, as it could result in the ethnic replacement of the ancestral population over the long term. The Emiratis would never have governance control again, as they only represent a small amount of the total population. Their population would be too small relative to the other ethnic communities that have been allowed in through migration. Currently, the Indian and Pakistani communities are the largest ethnic groups that reside in the UAE. If they used a democratic civic nation-state, It could mean that over time and after naturalization, it could be possible that the Indians and Pakistanis alone would have a majority of the voting power in the UAE, which means the country would be governed by people with a completely different ancestry and background. Imagine the potential conflict that could have happened due to this change in who governs the nation. The UAE has avoided all of these problems by simply adopting solutions that are more aligned with ethnic nationalism. One of the problems for the UAE around culture is the impact of such a large migrant community. It's much more difficult to sustain a certain culture when you have so many people that can influence that culture in their own direction. Although this might be a challenge, it is still the Emiratis that decide whether cultural changes are acceptable or not. They can stop issuing visas to any individual or community that is exhibiting behaviors or values that don't align with the preferences and interests of the Emirati population. By adopting an ethnically based governance solution, the Emiratis have created a system that protects their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. The Emiratis benefit from the contributions that are made by the migrant communities that reside in their country. And migrants can also enjoy economic opportunities and the lifestyle that the country has to offer. With civic nationalism, the reality is that you would need to accept that ancestry, ethnicity, genetics, and bloodline can't really matter that much. Voting power can move from one identity to another. This needs to be accepted as part of a civic nationalist solution. If you give people citizenship that don't share the same ancestral background, you are inviting demographic change, and you can't really control this over the long run. This change happens due to the rate of migration and reproduction. You can limit future migration, but you can't stop other communities from reproducing at any rate they want. So even restrictive civic nationalism is similar to a very open border policy in the sense that it changes the demographics and who has voting power. The difference between the two is just the speed of change. A strict migration policy means a slower process of the same outcome. It dilutes the ancestral identity and it can slowly reduce the self-determination of the ancestral population. It creates an environment where change could increasingly happen in the future due to even small differences in demographics becoming increasingly dramatic over time. All of this can lead to outcomes that may not have been desirable for the ancestral population. Ethnic nationalist solutions that prioritize things like ancestry, ethnicity, genetics, and bloodline in government and society help to prevent the problems that can eventually happen with civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism doesn't mean limiting people's freedom of movement or preventing multicultural societies. What it really does in practice is give distinct identities self-determination over the long term. It better protects the ancestral population's identity, which also includes their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. Each distinct identity across the world deserves self-determination to ensure the continuity of their population. Just like in a similar sense, we don't want to see decreasing biodiversity and lose certain animals, sea life, or insects due to our involvement with our environments. Ethnic nationalism is the more reliable way to protect the diversity of identities. Beyond the need to protect distinct identities, if existing countries set aside some land for other communities to start a new country in the future, they might not have the same requirements to protect a distinct identity or to protect those that built the society in the first place. In these situations, civic nationalism could make more sense, as in these cases, the country is brand new. It doesn't have an ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture that it wants to protect. Overlapping with liberal ideas, civic nationalism clearly has a number of flaws when it comes to protecting distinct identities over the long term. Hopefully, you found this useful to help with thinking about some of the differences between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. See you in the next one.